2020, an 11-year-old girl was walking along a beach in Somerset, England, with her father. She found a piece of bone half buried in a mud slope, then another, then another. When scientists examined what she had found, they realized she had stumbled onto the remains of the largest marine reptile ever formally described, an animal that had been lying on that coastline for 202 million years, waiting. The creature had no name until 2024. It had no known skeleton, no skull. The only evidence it existed at all was a fragment of jawbone, more than 6.5 feet long, and the bone showed it was still growing when it died. Scientists still don't know how large the adults were. The animal lived in the Late Triassic, a world before the Atlantic Ocean existed, before polar ice caps formed, when the continents were still locked together and a vast warm sea stretched across much of what is now Europe. In those waters, something was moving that dwarfed almost everything science had previously imagined possible for a marine reptile. Based on the jawbone alone, researchers estimate this animal reached 82 feet in length, roughly the size of a blue whale, possibly larger. But they are careful to say possibly, because all they have are fragments, and fragments can only tell you so much. In 2024, the creature finally received a name, Ichthyotitan severnensis. In this story, we are descending into the Triassic seas to understand what kind of ocean builds a giant like this, and why nothing like it has ever existed since. 202 million years ago, the map of Earth had not yet acquired the shapes that now seem permanent. Continents familiar today as separate worlds were joined into Pangaea, an immense supercontinent spanning latitudes and gathering most exposed land into a single connected mass. Its interior stretched so far from oceanic moisture that broad regions were seasonally arid, while monsoon systems carried rain across other margins. Red deserts, river plains, forests of conifers, cycads, and seed ferns occupied a landscape without grass or flowering plants. Along Pangaea's eastern reaches lay the Tethys Sea, a broad tropical marine realm opening between great arms of the supercontinent. Sunlight fell onto extensive continental shelves, where warm water covered low coastal platforms and supported dense food webs. Islands and submerged ridges divided portions of this marine realm, producing varied coastlines and basins across a belt of warm water extending through the tropics. Far beyond Pangaea's opposite margins spread Panthalassa, the immense global ocean surrounding the supercontinent. Much of its former seafloor has since vanished into Earth's mantle, leaving its history scattered among fragments carried onto continents by moving plates. The planet itself was warmer, permanent polar ice sheets were absent, and the difference between tropical and high-latitude climates was less severe than in the modern world. Sea level repeatedly shifted across low coastal terrain, creating broad marine environments where sediment settled over drowned landscapes. These shallow margins mattered because sunlight, nutrients, and warm temperatures could support abundant life. The sea was not an empty expanse around Pangaea. It was threaded with feeding grounds, migration routes, reefs, offshore basins, and shelves crowded with organisms whose descendants would inherit very different oceans. This particular moment belonged to the Rhaetian, the final age of the Triassic period, beginning roughly 208 million years ago and ending near 201 million years ago. By then, Pangaea was no longer mechanically whole. Forces deep within Earth were stretching its crust. Long rift valleys developed, where sections of the supercontinent were slowly being pulled apart. Magma rose beneath these weakened regions, and volcanic activity accompanied a geological rearrangement, that would eventually open new ocean basins. Life continued across this changing surface. Dinosaurs occupied terrestrial ecosystems, though the enormous forms associated with later periods had not yet transformed the land. Early mammals remained small. Pterosaurs crossed coastal skies on membranous wings. Conifer forests supplied the dominant tall vegetation, while ferns and other seed plants filled lower growth. No bird called from those branches, and no flower opened beneath them. The familiar texture of a modern landscape was still far away. Offshore, the difference was even greater. Coiled ammonites moved through the water in immense variety. Bony fish shared the sea with older lineages, while marine reptiles occupied ecological roles that mammals would not approach for more than 100 million years. Early plesiosaurs were beginning their history. Crocodilian relatives inhabited coastal and semi-aquatic environments. Beneath the surface, shells, teeth, scales, and bones accumulated in sediments that would eventually become the geological record. Farther from shore, another reptilian lineage had already reached a level of marine specialization unlike anything on land. Ichthyosaurs had spread through Triassic seas and diversified into hunters of many sizes and forms. Some had become immense, occupying the upper reaches of food webs across warm, open water. Ichthyotitan belonged to this final Triassic seascape, when tropical seas remained rich and giants still moved through them. Yet the rocks preserving that world also record strain beneath Pangaea, changing coastlines and environmental instability. Its ocean existed near the closing edge of an era, while the planet beneath it was already being remade. The transformation is written into the limbs. In the oldest members of the ichthyosaur lineage, bones that once carried weight on land were already being reshaped for movement through water. Around 250 million years ago, during the opening chapters of the Triassic, their ancestors had returned to an aquatic existence. Exactly which terrestrial reptile gave rise to them remains unresolved, but their anatomy preserves the direction of travel. This was a lineage surrendering the shore. Early forms such as Cartorhynchus and Chaosaurus still carried proportions that betrayed that ancestry. Their bodies were elongated, their limbs retained recognizable digits, and their skeletons lacked the extreme streamlining seen in later descendants. Yet natural selection was already remodeling them. Weight-bearing joints became less important, hands and feet broadened, individual finger bones multiplied in some lineages, packing together into stiff paddles better suited to steering than walking. Over evolutionary time, the transformation reached nearly every part of the body. The neck shortened until the head flowed smoothly into the torso. Snouts lengthened. Vertebral columns became specialized for powerful swimming. A tall dorsal fin stabilized movement, while a crescent-shaped tail fin supplied much of the propulsion. The hind limbs diminished in importance, and the forelimbs became hydrofoils used to maneuver through water. The result carried a striking resemblance to animals that would evolve much later. Seen only in outline, many advanced ichthyosaurs could be mistaken for dolphins or fast pelagic fish. Their ancestors were unrelated, yet water imposed the same physical demands upon them. A streamlined body reduces drag. A compact neck prevents unnecessary turbulence. Fins provide control without the resistance created by projecting limbs. Evolution had reached similar engineering solutions through entirely separate branches of life. Their commitment extended far beyond external shape. Ichthyosaurs remained reptiles that breathed atmospheric air, so every dive eventually ended at the surface. Their reproduction, however, no longer required land. Fossils preserve pregnant individuals with embryos inside their bodies, along with remarkable specimens recording birth itself. In several later ichthyosaurs, young were positioned to emerge tail first, reducing the time the head was exposed before the newborn could reach the surface and breathe. Earlier species show that reproductive orientation changed during the lineage's evolution. Eventually, returning to shore was no longer practical. Their paddle-shaped limbs could steer a large body through seawater, but could not support it effectively on land. Birth therefore occurred in the marine environment, completing a transition that few vertebrate groups have carried so completely. Soft tissue fossils reveal another layer of specialization. A Jurassic ichthyosaur called Stenopterygius, preserved in Germany's Posidonia shale, retained traces of skin and underlying tissue around its skeleton. Chemical and microscopic evidence indicates an insulating layer consistent with blubber, suggesting that ichthyosaurs possessed a means of conserving body heat comparable in function to the fatty insulation of modern marine mammals. Pigment-bearing structures preserved in exceptional specimens also show that their skin carried dark coloration, although the exact color pattern across the entire group remains uncertain. None of these features evolved because ichthyosaurs were becoming mammals or fish. They emerged because an air-breathing reptile living permanently at sea faced many of the same physical problems encountered by dolphins, whales, sharks, and tuna. By the later Triassic, little in their outward form still advertised an animal descended from terrestrial ancestors. The feet had become paddles, the spine powered an efficient swimmer, reproduction occurred at sea, and insulation helped sustain an active marine existence. Land had ceased to be part of their lives. What remained was a reptile rebuilt by the ocean, generation after generation, until almost every trace of walking had been transformed into swimming. Size usually takes time. Large bodies demand more food, slower reproduction, stronger skeletons, efficient circulation, and an ecosystem capable of paying the enormous energetic cost of maintaining them. Yet early ichthyosaurs compressed that evolutionary journey into a remarkably narrow interval. Soon after their lineage entered the marine record, some were already approaching dimensions that most ocean vertebrates would never reach. Around 249 million years ago, the earliest known ichthyosaurs were modest animals. Some measured only several feet in length, occupying a marine world still recovering from the greatest biological crisis known in Earth's history. Then their trajectory changed with unusual speed. Within roughly 3 million years, an ichthyosaur existed whose body stretched more than 50 feet from head to tail. Its name was Symbospondylus youngorum. The fossil came from the Augusta Mountains of Nevada, preserved in rocks dating to approximately 246 million years ago. Its skull alone measured more than 6 feet long. Comparisons with related skeletons suggested an overall body length approaching 56 feet, placing an immense marine reptile remarkably close to the beginning of ichthyosaur evolution. The timing is what makes the animal so significant. Symbospondylus youngorum did not appear after tens of millions of years of gradual increases in body size. It lived only a few million years after the earliest ichthyosaurs known from the fossil record. In evolutionary terms, gigantism had arrived almost immediately. Whales followed a much slower path. Their earliest relatives began adapting to aquatic life around 56 million years ago. Fully marine cetaceans eventually appeared, followed much later by the baleen whales, whose feeding systems could support extreme size. Truly gigantic whales emerged only after many tens of millions of years of cetacean evolution. Depending on how gigantism is defined and which fossils are compared, the contrast remains striking. Ichthyosaurs reached enormous size far earlier in their marine history. Part of the explanation lies beneath them in the food web. Only a few million years before the first ichthyosaurs appeared, the end Permian mass extinction had devastated marine ecosystems. Roughly 80% or more of marine species disappeared, with some older estimates placing the loss considerably higher. Entire ecological networks were dismantled, predatory communities vanished, reefs collapsed, and many long-established lineages were reduced or erased. Recovery did not simply recreate the Permian Ocean. New ecosystems assembled from survivors and rapidly diversifying newcomers. Ammonoids rebounded with exceptional speed. Conodont animals remained abundant, while fishes and other marine organisms expanded through newly available ecological space. In some early Triassic seas, prey resources accumulated faster than large predator communities could fully reorganize around them. For an emerging lineage of efficient swimmers, that imbalance created opportunity. The upper reaches of the food web contained fewer established competitors than they had before the extinction. Large body size could increase swimming efficiency, expand feeding range, reduce vulnerability to predators, and allow access to prey unavailable to smaller hunters. Once sufficient food existed to sustain greater mass, natural selection had room to explore increasingly large forms. This does not mean gigantism followed a simple upward staircase. Early ichthyosaurs diversified into many sizes, and Symbospondylus youngorum represents one branch among a complicated radiation. Its importance lies in demonstrating what had already become biologically possible so soon after the lineage appeared. The contrast with whales also reflects different worlds rather than a race between evolutionary groups. Cetaceans evolved inside mature Cenozoic ecosystems crowded with established sharks, fishes, marine mammals, and complex food webs. Early ichthyosaurs expanded through oceans recently stripped of much of their former ecological structure. A mass extinction had removed countless inhabitants, but it had also opened biological space. Into that space came reptiles newly committed to the sea. Within a span barely visible against geological time, one of them had already become a giant. Among ichthyosaurs, enormous size was not scattered evenly across the evolutionary tree. It became concentrated in a remarkable succession of Triassic forms commonly associated with the Shastosaurid lineage. Animals whose fossils trace a long experiment in building bodies at the upper limits of marine vertebrate size. Their classification remains debated because several giant species are known from incomplete skeletons, but together they reveal that extreme scale persisted across widely separated seas and millions of years. The family name Shastosauridae comes from Mount Shasta in California, near the region where important early material helped define these unusual ichthyosaurs. Compared with the compact, dolphin-shaped forms familiar from later Jurassic rocks, many Shastosaurids carried elongated bodies, relatively small skulls, and proportions suited to sustained movement through open water. Their feeding anatomy varied considerably, warning against treating the entire family as a single ecological type. What united its giants most clearly was scale. One of the best known appeared in what is now Nevada during the Carnian Age, around 230 million years ago. Shawnosaurus popularis is represented by numerous individuals from the rocks of Berlin Ichthyosaur State Park. Adults reached roughly 50 feet in length, making them among the largest vertebrates in their environment. Their remains accumulated in numbers unusual for animals of such size, preserving an extraordinary record of a giant ichthyosaur population rather than a lone, fragmentary individual. Later came an even larger relative from Western Canada, Shawnosaurus sicaniensis, discovered in British Columbia, lived during the Norian Age roughly 215 million years ago. The known skeleton indicates a body around 69 feet long. For years, it stood as the largest formally described ichthyosaur, extending the shastosaurid pattern of gigantism far beyond the dimensions seen in most marine reptiles. The geography of these animals reaches farther still. Himalayasaurus tibetensis was discovered in Tibet, in rocks that formed when this part of Asia belonged to a very different arrangement of continents and seas. Its fossils include large skeletal elements and teeth, placing another immense ichthyosaur within waters connected to the ancient Tethyan realm. Today, those marine rocks stand high within the Himalayas. Plate collision eventually lifted sediments deposited beneath prehistoric seas into one of the highest mountain systems on Earth, carrying the remains of marine reptiles upward with them. Across these fossils, gigantism was therefore not confined to one coastline or one brief evolutionary episode. Giant ichthyosaurs occupied marine environments across enormous distances during successive stages of the Triassic. Their record stretches through roughly 30 million years, although it is broken by missing intervals and by the uneven preservation that always shapes paleontology. That incompleteness becomes especially important near the end of the period. After Shawnosaurus sicaniensis, the record of the very largest forms thins dramatically. Roughly 13 million years separate that Canadian giant from the age represented by Ichthyotitan in southwest England. Rocks from those intervening years have not yet supplied a continuous sequence showing how the lineage changed. The absence cannot safely be treated as biological disappearance. Large oceanic animals are difficult to preserve, and a complete chain of fossils requires the unlikely combination of death, rapid burial, mineralization, survival through geological upheaval, exposure, and discovery. Entire populations can therefore exist without leaving fossils that humans have recognized. At the far end of that missing interval, enormous jaw material appears in rocks about 202 million years old. Its anatomy links Ichthyotitan with the broader tradition of giant late Triassic ichthyosaurs, though its precise family placement remains cautious because so little of the skeleton survives. The lineage that had produced immense forms across Nevada, British Columbia, and the ancient Tethyan world had reached its final known chapter in the rocks of Somerset. A creature known from fragments must be measured through relationships. There is no complete Ichthyotitan skeleton laid out from snout to tail, no articulated backbone showing its proportions, and no preserved outline revealing the length of its body. Its enormous size emerges instead from comparative anatomy, using a particular bone from the lower jaw as a surviving piece of biological geometry. That bone is the cerangular. It formed part of the rear section of the lower jaw, where several bones join to support the skull and transmit the forces involved in feeding. Both known Ichthyotitan individuals are represented principally by fragments of this element. The more complete specimen, recovered by Ruby Reynolds and her father Justin, preserves a reconstructed cerangular more than 7 feet long. Its dimensions immediately place the animal beyond familiar territory. Paleontologists compared the bone with corresponding elements from giant Triassic ichthyosaurs, whose skeletons preserve enough anatomy to provide a reference. Especially important was Shawnosaurus sicaniensis, the immense Canadian species long regarded as one of the largest ichthyosaurs known. Its body has generally been reconstructed at around 69 feet. The Ichthyotitan jaw element was substantially larger than the equivalent structure used for comparison. Scaling from these proportions produced an estimated total length of roughly 82 feet. At that scale, The animal occupied the same broad length range as many adult blue whales. A marine reptile from more than 200 million years ago had entered dimensions that today belong to the largest living animals. Yet the calculation contains an unavoidable uncertainty. Scaling one species from another assumes that corresponding parts of their bodies maintained reasonably similar proportions. Nature does not always cooperate. One species can have a proportionally longer skull, shorter trunk, broader jaw, or differently shaped skeleton than its relatives. Without vertebrae, a complete skull, limbs, and tail from Ichthyotitan, those proportions cannot be measured directly. The researchers therefore treated 82 feet as an estimate rather than a fixed measurement. Their work explicitly acknowledged the scarcity of material and the conventional nature of reconstructing total size from incomplete remains. Even identifying the precise evolutionary relationships of such fragmentary giants requires caution. A 7-foot jaw element can establish extraordinary scale without revealing exactly where the tail ended. Microscopic structure adds another dimension to the evidence. Thin sections taken from the bone reveal rapidly deposited tissue and patterns associated with continued growth. The specimen does not appear to represent an animal that had reached full skeletal maturity. Its bones were still developing when it died. That finding does not provide a reliable number for its eventual adult length. Growth rates can slow dramatically as large vertebrates mature, and the amount of growth remaining cannot simply be projected from the preserved tissue. It does mean that the known individual may not represent the upper limit of its species. Occasional fragmentary remains from giant Late Triassic ichthyosaurs have encouraged suggestions that some individuals could have approached 100 feet. Such possibilities remain speculative unless diagnostic material can be described, compared, and published with sufficient evidence. They cannot presently be assigned to Ichthyotitan with confidence, nor can they establish a larger adult size. Even the comparison with blue whales needs the same restraint. Blue whales vary considerably between individuals and populations, with exceptionally large animals exceeding the estimated length of Ichthyotitan. The fossils therefore do not demonstrate that this reptile surpassed the largest whale ever recorded. They establish something subtler and scientifically stronger. Its estimated dimensions overlap the scale occupied by Earth's largest living animal. From 2 incomplete lower jaws, paleontology can recover a range rather than an exact silhouette. The evidence supports an animal around 82 feet long while leaving its mature maximum unresolved. Within those limits, Ichthyotitan severnensis stands as probably the largest marine reptile yet formally described, represented not by a complete giant in stone, but by enough bone to reveal the scale of the body that once carried it. At immense size, survival becomes a problem of internal machinery. An animal can possess a streamlined body and powerful tail, yet neither matters for long unless its tissues receive enough oxygen, its muscles remain warm enough to work, and its metabolism can sustain movement between breaths. For Ichthyotitan, those demands would have operated across an enormous volume of living tissue every moment it remained at sea. Temperature was among the fundamental challenges. Reptiles are traditionally associated with body temperatures strongly influenced by their surroundings, but ichthyosaurs do not fit comfortably within that pattern. Chemical signatures preserved in fossil material indicate that at least some species maintained body temperatures substantially above the surrounding seawater. Studies of oxygen isotopes in teeth have supported elevated, relatively stable internal temperatures consistent with some degree of endothermy. Generating heat internally changes what an aquatic animal can do. Muscles can remain active as water temperatures fall, allowing sustained swimming across different environments rather than restricting activity to the warmest surface layers. For a giant ichthyosaur, sheer size would also help. Large bodies lose heat more slowly relative to their volume because proportionally less tissue lies near the external surface. Gigantism itself, therefore, becomes part of the thermal system. Heat production alone is expensive if warmth escapes directly into seawater. Exceptional fossils suggest ichthyosaurs evolved another solution. A specimen of Stenopterygius from Germany preserves traces of soft tissue around the body, including evidence interpreted as a layer of insulating fat beneath the skin. Functionally comparable to blubber in whales and dolphins, such tissue would reduce heat loss while also storing energy. Breathing created a different constraint. Ichthyotitan had lungs, not gills, so oxygen taken in at the surface had to support every period spent submerged. Larger animals possess greater absolute volumes of blood and muscle, providing more tissue in which oxygen can be carried or stored. Modern diving vertebrates enhance this capacity through oxygen-binding proteins in blood and muscle, reduced circulation to less essential tissues during dives, and careful control of heart rate. The exact physiology of Ichthyotitan cannot be reconstructed from its jaw bones, but other ichthyosaurs preserve evidence that prolonged diving formed part of their lives. Some fossil ichthyosaur skeletons contain lesions interpreted as avascular necrosis, damage associated with disruption of blood supply and sometimes linked to decompression sickness. Similar injuries can occur when dissolved gases form bubbles during rapid changes in pressure. Their presence has been used to investigate diving behavior in ichthyosaurs, although interpreting individual lesions requires caution because bone damage can have several causes. Pressure also shaped sensory anatomy. In some ichthyosaurs, enormous eyes were supported by rings of overlapping bones called sclerotic rings. Temnodontosaurus possessed eye structures indicating an eyeball more than 10 inches across. Large eyes could gather scarce light during dives or low-light hunting, while the surrounding bony ring helped support the globe. This architecture suggests that vision remained useful far below brightly illuminated surface waters. For Ichthyotitan specifically, no eye socket, lung tissue, muscle, or skin has survived. Its physiology must therefore be approached through the broader ichthyosaur lineage rather than assigned from direct evidence. Yet that lineage demonstrates that marine reptiles evolved sophisticated solutions to thermal regulation, insulation, diving, and sustained activity long before whales existed. Nothing about those solutions made ichthyosaurs partly mammalian. They remained reptiles throughout their history. The resemblance lies in function. Water removes heat in the same way from unrelated bodies. Pressure acts according to the same physics, and oxygen becomes limited whenever lungs descend beneath the surface. Evolution encountered those constraints in the Triassic and assembled one set of answers from reptilian anatomy. More than 100 million years later, marine mammals would confront the same boundaries and arrive at many comparable solutions. Light disappears from seawater by degrees. Red wavelengths vanish first, then orange and yellow, while blue penetrates farther before weakening into darkness. For an animal hunting below the sunlit surface, every additional photon becomes useful. Ichthyosaurs evolved eyes that push this requirement toward an anatomical extreme, turning vision into one of the most distinctive features of their entire lineage. The clearest evidence survives not as the soft eyeball itself, but as the architecture surrounding it. Ichthyosaur skulls often contain enormous circular openings called orbits. Inside them sat a structure known as the sclerotic ring, formed from overlapping plates of bone arranged around the eye. Similar rings occur in birds and many reptiles, where they help support the eyeball and provide attachment for tissues involved in focusing. In ichthyosaurs, these rings could become immense. Temnodontosaurus, a large predatory ichthyosaur from the early Jurassic, possessed an eye estimated at more than 10 inches across. Its sclerotic ring was correspondingly enormous, giving this animal one of the largest known eyes among vertebrates. Relative to body size, ichthyosaur eyes reached proportions unmatched by most other vertebrate groups. Size mattered because a larger eye can admit more light. The pupil can expand across a greater area, allowing faint illumination to reach the retina when smaller eyes would receive less usable information. In deep water, where sunlight has been filtered through hundreds of feet of seawater, this can extend the range at which movement, silhouettes, and prey remain detectable. The sclerotic ring also strengthened the eye structurally, although its relationship with diving pressure is more complicated than a simple protective brace. Water pressure increases with depth, but pressure inside an air-breathing diver's tissues is transmitted throughout the body. Researchers therefore use the dimensions of ichthyosaur eyes primarily to study optical performance, rather than treating the ring alone as proof of extreme depth. One particularly revealing genus is Ophthalmosaurus, whose name itself reflects its remarkable eyes. Analyses of its eye geometry suggest exceptional sensitivity under low illumination. Estimates based on aperture size and focal length indicate visual performance suited to conditions comparable with deep marine environments, potentially allowing effective hunting far beneath bright surface waters. Such adaptations would have changed the daily geography of an ichthyosaur's world. The surface provided air, but feeding opportunities could extend downward through layers where daylight progressively weakened. Fish and cephalopods moved vertically through the water column, and some prey occupied depths where vision demanded specialized equipment. An animal capable of following them was not confined to the narrow, illuminated ceiling of the ocean. Modern comparisons provide scale without implying identical behavior. Sperm whales routinely descend thousands of feet while pursuing deep water prey, though they rely heavily on echolocation rather than enormous eyes. Ichthyosaurs evolved long before toothed whales and appear to have emphasized a different sensory pathway. Their skulls preserve no evidence for cetacean-style sonar. Vision, particularly in large-eyed forms, may therefore have carried greater importance during low-light hunting. For Ichthyotitan, the evidence stops before the eye begins. Neither known specimen preserves an orbit, sclerotic ring, or any structure from which its visual anatomy can be reconstructed. Its enormous body does not guarantee proportionally enormous eyes, and assigning the extreme dimensions of later ichthyosaurs directly to it would go beyond the fossils. Still, Ichthyotitan belonged to a lineage in which visual specialization had become deeply established. Across ichthyosaur evolution, eyes were repeatedly shaped for gathering light in marine environments where illumination could fade rapidly with depth. Their bony rings remain in fossil skulls long after the delicate tissues they supported have disappeared. Through those circles of bone, an ancient sensory world becomes partly recoverable. The ocean was not divided simply between visible surface and featureless depth. For ichthyosaurs equipped with extraordinary eyes, usable vision could follow prey downward as daylight thinned, extending their hunting realm into water where the human eye would find almost nothing at all. May of 2016 began the scientific story with 5 pieces lying separately on a beach. Paul de la Salle, an experienced fossil collector, was searching the shore near Lilstock in Somerset, southwest England. When he noticed fragments, unlike the smaller fossils commonly released from the surrounding cliffs, their surfaces had the texture of fossilized bone, but their thickness suggested something unusually substantial. He collected the pieces and began fitting them together. Broken edges aligned. Curves continued from one fragment into another. What had appeared scattered across the shore gradually became part of a single anatomical structure. De La Salle later compared the process to assembling an ancient prehistoric jigsaw puzzle, except the missing pieces belonged to an animal separated from its finder by more than 200 million years. The reconstructed element was more than 3 feet long, although significant portions were absent. Its size initially made identification difficult. Large fossil fragments can lose the landmarks that reveal where they belonged in a skeleton, particularly after erosion has worn their surfaces. Yet enough anatomy remained to indicate that this was part of a lower jaw, specifically a syringular, one of the bones extending along the rear portion of the mandible. Nothing about its dimensions was ordinary. De La Salle contacted paleontologist Dean Lomax, whose research focused heavily on ichthyosaurs. Lomax was affiliated with the University of Manchester and had worked extensively with British marine reptile fossils. Examination of the Lilstock material brought the fragment into comparison with giant Triassic ichthyosaurs, known from much more complete remains. The closest useful reference was Shonosaurus severnensis from British Columbia. Because its skeleton preserved corresponding jaw anatomy, researchers could compare equivalent structures rather than simply judging the Somerset fossil by appearance. The Lilstock bone appeared roughly 1/4 larger than the comparable element in that already immense Canadian animal. Such scaling had consequences far beyond the jaw. In 2018, De La Salle, Lomax, and colleagues published their analysis of the specimen. Their study identified it as belonging to a giant ichthyosaur from the latest Triassic and explored estimates that placed the original animal somewhere around 66 to 85 feet long. Even the lower end represented exceptional size. The upper estimate approached the dimensions of the largest vertebrates alive today. The researchers also confronted an older paleontological puzzle. Large bone fragments from late Triassic rocks in Europe had previously been interpreted by some researchers as belonging to enormous terrestrial dinosaurs. The Lilstock specimen offered another possibility. At least some mysterious giant bones from these deposits could instead represent pieces of immense ichthyosaur jaws, distorted by incompleteness and difficult to identify without better comparative material. Still, the Lilstock fossil could carry the argument only so far. It was isolated, incomplete, and represented a structure whose proportions were known from only a limited number of giant ichthyosaurs. Scaling an entire animal from one fragment required assumptions about anatomical similarity. The fossil established the presence of something enormous, but precision remained beyond its reach. Nor could the researchers confidently create a new species from it. Naming an animal requires anatomical features capable of distinguishing it reliably from relatives. Great size alone is rarely sufficient. Individuals vary, bones grow, and unrelated lineages can independently become enormous. So the specimen remained scientifically important without receiving the identity it would later help define. It had emerged from the Somerset coast, been assembled by a collector, and entered the literature as evidence for an ichthyosaur of exceptional scale. For several years, that was where the evidence rested. 5 weathered fragments preserved in stone had revealed the outline of a giant, while leaving its exact place in the Triassic Ocean unresolved. 4 years after the Lilstock fragments entered the scientific record, another piece of the same ancient puzzle surfaced farther along the Somerset coast. In late May of 2020, 11-year-old Ruby Reynolds and her father, Justin Reynolds, traveled to Blue Anchor to search for fossils. Britain was living through the first year of the global pandemic, but along the shore, erosion continued exposing material from rocks formed at the end of the Triassic. Near the upper part of the beach, Justin noticed a fragment of fossilized bone that someone had apparently found and left behind. It measured roughly 4 inches long, larger than the pieces he was accustomed to seeing there. He stopped to examine it, while Ruby continued searching. She moved farther along the shore, studying the exposed sediment. Before long, another fragment appeared, partly embedded in a mud slope. This piece was roughly twice the length of the first and considerably better preserved. Its surface and internal texture suggested that both fragments belonged to something substantial. More pieces emerged during subsequent visits. The Reynolds family carefully documented the material, and photographs eventually reached Dean Lomax. The shape was familiar. The fragments represented another serrangular, the same part of the lower jaw identified in the giant specimen discovered by Paul de la Salle in 2016. Geology strengthened the connection. The Blue Anchor material came from the Westbury Mudstone Formation, the same latest Triassic rock unit that had yielded the Lilstock specimen. The two discovery sites lay only about 6 miles apart, along the Somerset coastline. Separate animals, separated in death and burial, had left remarkably similar pieces of jaw in rocks of essentially the same age. This second specimen changed the scientific situation because it preserved considerably more anatomy. Over several collecting trips, additional pieces were recovered and fitted together until the reconstructed bone extended beyond 6 feet. Features along its surface could now be compared in greater detail with the earlier specimen and with other enormous ichthyosaurs. The resemblance was not based on size alone. Both Somerset specimens shared distinctive anatomical characteristics, providing evidence that they represented the same kind of animal. The new material also strengthened estimates, placing its body at roughly 82 feet long, although the incomplete skeleton still required caution in reconstructing exact proportions. Inside the bone lay another record. Researchers removed small samples and prepared thin sections that could be examined under a microscope. Under magnification, fossil bone ceases to look like featureless stone. Channels, fibers, growth patterns, and zones of remodeling preserve aspects of how living tissue formed. The Blue Anchor specimen showed unusual patterns of bone development associated with rapid growth in giant ichthyosaurs. Its outer tissue lacked clear evidence that skeletal growth had completely ceased. The individual appears to have died before reaching full maturity, meaning the enormous dimensions inferred from its jaw did not necessarily represent the maximum size attainable by the species. Analysis continued for several years. Researchers compared the Somerset bones anatomically and microscopically, studied their geological setting, and considered whether the shared features were sufficient to distinguish them from previously named ichthyosaurs. By 2024, the evidence supported formal recognition. In April of that year, the description appeared in the scientific journal Public Library of Science 1. The animal received the name Ichthyotitan severnensis, combining words referring to a giant fish lizard with the Severn region associated with its discovery. Ruby Reynolds and Justin Reynolds were included among the paper's authors, alongside Paul de la Salle, Dean Lomax, Marcello Perillo, and their collaborators. Ruby had been 11 when she noticed the bone emerging from Somerset mud. What she found did more than add another fragment to a collection. It supplied the independent specimen that allowed an immense animal, previously visible only through uncertain remains, to receive a scientific identity after more than 200 million years. A fossil bone is not a finished object. Beneath its weathered surface lies a record written while the animal was alive, preserved in microscopic layers that can outlast oceans, continents, and entire branches of evolution. For Ichthyotitan severnensis, that hidden record matters enormously, because almost everything known about the animal must be extracted from two incomplete lower jaw bones. The surviving elements are portions of the cerangular, a large bone forming the rear part of the lower jaw in many reptiles. Their outer shapes provide one set of clues. Their internal tissues provide another. Researchers could compare contours, ridges, proportions, and attachment surfaces with equivalent bones from other enormous ichthyosaurs, while microscopic examination revealed how those bones had actually grown. To investigate that growth, thin sections were prepared from the fossil material and examined under polarized light. When fossil bone is sliced finely enough, its internal architecture becomes visible. Networks of vascular spaces appear beside layers of mineralized tissue, preserving patterns created as living bone was deposited, remodeled, and supplied with blood. In the Ichthyotitan material, that architecture was unusual. Researchers described a form of atypical osteogenesis, meaning that bone formation followed a distinctive pattern, unlike the more orderly growth expected in many vertebrates. The tissue had been deposited rapidly, with an irregular organization associated with exceptionally fast skeletal expansion. Similar architecture has been recognized in other gigantic ichthyosaurs, linking immense body size not merely with prolonged growth, but with extraordinary rates of tissue production. Rapid growth leaves physical consequences because bone must balance construction with strength. Swimming placed the skeleton under repeated bending and muscular forces as an enormous body accelerated, turned, and transferred power through the skull and trunk. The cerangular itself reflects that demanding mechanical role. Its interior contains cancellous bone, a network of supporting struts and spaces surrounded by more compact regions. Such architecture can distribute forces without making every part of a large bone uniformly solid. Surface features also preserve areas where muscles, connective tissues, and neighboring bones interacted, allowing comparative anatomists to reconstruct relationships even when most of the skull is missing. Computed tomography and detailed anatomical study offer ways of reading internal structures without relying only on exposed surfaces. Density changes, fractures, cavities, and three-dimensional geometry can help separate original anatomy from geological distortion. Yet the strongest conclusions still depend on comparison with better preserved ichthyosaurs. Those comparisons place the Somerset material among giant ichthyosaurs and support affinities with the enormous forms traditionally associated with shastasaurids. At the same time, incompleteness limits precision. A cerangular cannot reveal the full skull, vertebral column, flippers, tail, or exact proportions of the living animal. Classification therefore rests on the characters actually preserved rather than on an imagined complete skeleton. One microscopic feature carries particular importance. Near the outer surface, the bone lacks an external fundamental system, the dense, slowly deposited tissue that develops when skeletal growth has effectively stopped. Its absence indicates that this individual had not reached full skeletal maturity. The jaw belonged to an animal already immense, yet its bones were still recording active growth. That evidence changes what the fragments represent. They are not merely oversized pieces used to scale a reconstruction. Each preserves anatomy at several levels, from gross shape to microscopic tissue organization, and each independently records a lineage capable of building enormous bodies at remarkable speed. Only two partial jaw bones have crossed more than 200 million years into human hands. Their surfaces identify relationships, their proportions constrain size, and their internal fabric preserves the tempo of growth. Much of Ichthyotitan remains physically absent, but the surviving bone is far from empty. A body on the scale of Ichthyotitan could exist only where energy moved through the ocean in extraordinary abundance. Every sweep of its tail, every journey through open water, every season of continued growth had to be paid for in food. Yet the animal left behind no complete skull, no preserved stomach contents, and no teeth that can be confidently assigned to it. Its diet therefore survives as a problem reconstructed from anatomy, relatives, and the ecosystem surrounding it. Late Triassic seas contained several possible sources of that energy. Ammonites were widespread and diverse, their coiled shells enclosing soft bodies related to modern cephalopods. Other cephalopods shared the water with abundant fishes, while marine reptiles occupied different predatory roles. Small prey could gather in concentrations large enough to make repeated feeding worthwhile, creating opportunities for predators whose immense bodies demanded dependable resources rather than occasional meals. The Shastosaurid lineage offers clues, although it does not provide a single feeding model. Some giant ichthyosaurs possessed teeth capable of seizing slippery prey. Others developed skulls with reduced dentition, and Shastosaurus became especially unusual. Its jaws were elongated and slender, while functional teeth appear to have been greatly reduced or absent in adults. That anatomy once inspired an intriguing proposal. Shastosaurus might have captured soft prey through suction, rapidly drawing water and animals into its mouth in a manner broadly reminiscent of some living marine mammals. Squid-like cephalopods became natural candidates. Later research questioned whether its skull possessed the specialized structures expected in a powerful suction feeder, however, leaving the exact mechanism unresolved. Tooth reduction does not automatically reveal how an animal fed. Ichthyotitan presents an even greater uncertainty. Its surviving jaw material establishes tremendous scale, but the portion carrying the teeth has not been recovered. There is no secure evidence that it was toothless, strongly toothed, or anatomically identical to Shastosaurus. Assigning it a precise menu would therefore go beyond the fossils. Still, size places unavoidable demands on the reconstruction. An animal roughly 80 feet long required a substantial and recurring flow of calories. Depending on metabolism, activity, prey quality, and feeding strategy, consumption could have reached hundreds of pounds of prey across a day, although any exact figure remains speculative. Large body size can also reduce metabolic expenditure relative to mass, meaning a giant does not simply require the diet of a smaller predator multiplied directly by its weight. Dense concentrations of cephalopods and fishes would have offered an efficient solution. Instead of pursuing isolated prey repeatedly, a large ichthyosaur could exploit patches where food was concentrated. If Ichthyotitan inherited reduced teeth from some of its relatives, soft-bodied prey becomes especially plausible. If stronger dentition eventually emerges from future fossils, larger fishes or marine reptiles could enter the picture more prominently. Ecological modeling provides another constraint. Triassic marine food webs were productive enough to sustain gigantic ichthyosaurs, but supporting animals at such scale required energy to pass efficiently upward from abundant lower levels. Primary producers nourished small consumers. Those organisms supported fishes and cephalopods, and those populations supplied increasingly large predators. Giants stood at the expensive end of that transfer. Their fossil distribution also reflects where suitable marine ecosystems existed, though it does not support a simple division between a productive tethys and an impoverished panthalassic ocean. Giant ichthyosaurs are known from regions bordering both great marine realms, including Western North America. Local productivity, currents, continental margins, and prey concentrations probably mattered more than the name assigned to the surrounding ocean. Ichthyotitan's meals remain unseen, but its existence proves something fundamental about its environment. Somewhere within those late Triassic waters, enough living matter was being produced, concentrated, and consumed to sustain a vertebrate approaching the dimensions of the largest animals alive today. The waters surrounding the late Triassic archipelagos of what would become Western Europe carried the chemistry of a greenhouse world. Around 202 million years ago, the region occupied subtropical latitudes near the margins of the vast Tethyan realm, where rising seas spread across low terrain and repeatedly connected broad shelves, lagoons, deeper basins, and open marine passages. The result was not one uniform tropical pool, but a shifting mosaic of habitats linked by warm water. Across the planet, there were no permanent polar ice sheets comparable to those of the modern world. Late Triassic sea surface temperatures were generally warmer than today, although values varied with latitude, circulation, season, and the methods used to reconstruct them. Some estimates place average conditions several degrees Fahrenheit above modern equivalents. Higher sea levels allowed marine water to penetrate continental margins, enlarging the spaces in which coastal ecosystems could develop. Life filled those waters at many scales. Ammonites were among the most conspicuous inhabitants. Their chambered shells ranged through numerous shapes and sizes, while their rapid evolution and broad distribution would eventually make them exceptionally useful fossils for dating marine rocks. They were cephalopods, distant relatives of living squid, octopuses, and nautiluses, and their abundance placed them within food webs that connected small drifting organisms to large predators. Far less visually imposing were conodont animals, slender early vertebrates known especially from microscopic tooth-like elements composed of mineralized tissue. Their feeding biology remains debated, so they cannot confidently be described as simple filter feeders. Yet their remains occur so widely and change so rapidly through geological time that conodont elements became some of the most precise tools for correlating ancient strata. Their lineage was nearing its end during the latest Triassic, disappearing around the boundary that closed the period. Fishes were changing as well. Neopterygians, members of the great ray-finned branch that ultimately includes most living fishes, had already diversified into increasingly varied forms. Alongside them moved sharks and other cartilaginous fishes, each occupying portions of an expanding marine network. Smaller animals converted planktonic and benthic productivity into flesh that could pass upward through successive predators. Marine reptiles added another layer. Sauropterygians had spent much of the Triassic exploring coastal and offshore ways of life, and by the latest Triassic, the earliest plesiosaurs were appearing. Their body plan, with 4 powerful flippers and a distinct trunk, represented a different solution to marine locomotion from the tail-driven ichthyosaurs. These groups shared seas without occupying precisely identical ecological roles. Closer to land, The boundary between terrestrial and marine ecosystems could blur. Rivers carried sediment and organic material toward estuaries. Tides redistributed nutrients across submerged flats. Storms disturbed bottom communities and sometimes transported bones far from where animals died. Pterosaurs crossed above shorelines, while dinosaurs and other reptiles inhabited nearby land. A stranded marine carcass could therefore become a temporary bridge between ecosystems, feeding scavengers that normally never entered the sea. The Westbury mudstone that eventually preserved the known remains of Ichthyotitan records part of this marine setting. Its dark sediments accumulated during intervals when fine material settled onto the seabed, capturing scattered remains from an ecosystem whose living complexity is now represented by fragments, shells, teeth, and chemical traces. Within that network, Ichthyotitan occupied an extraordinary scale. Calling it an unchallenged apex predator would exceed the evidence, because its teeth, stomach contents, and hunting behavior remain unknown. What can be said is more restrained and no less remarkable. The ecosystem generated enough biological energy to support an ichthyosaur approaching 80 feet in length. Warm seas, abundant prey communities, productive margins, and interconnected food webs together made such a body possible, while the mud beneath those waters preserved only the faintest pieces of the world that sustained it. Size did not divide the late Triassic Sea into rulers and subjects. It divided opportunity. Every predator moved through a particular combination of depth, prey, coastline, swimming style, and body size, creating overlapping territories without requiring every large animal to compete for exactly the same resources. Ichthyotitan occupied the extreme upper end of this system, but the waters around it contained an intricate community of marine reptiles built for very different lives. Among the most important were other ichthyosaurs. By the Raetian age, the group had already produced an extraordinary range of forms. Some were compact pursuit hunters with streamlined bodies and jaws suited to catching fishes or cephalopods. Others carried different tooth shapes, suggesting specialized diets. Resource partitioning allowed several species to inhabit the same broad marine region while concentrating on prey of different sizes, hunting in different places, or feeding through different strategies. For an animal approaching 80 feet long, this mattered. Smaller ichthyosaurs did not need to challenge Ichthyotitan directly. Their lower energetic requirements opened prey categories that might have been inefficient for a giant to pursue individually. A school of small fish could sustain a smaller hunter through rapid attacks, while an enormous predator would benefit more from dense concentrations of food or larger prey. Scale itself helped separate ecological roles. Early plesiosaurs added another style of movement. Their four flippers propelled comparatively broad bodies through the water, unlike the tail-dominated locomotion of ichthyosaurs. During the latest Triassic, plesiosaurs were still near the beginning of a lineage that would become far more diverse during the Jurassic. They had not yet produced the enormous forms familiar from later marine ecosystems, so their presence beside Ichthyotitan represented coexistence rather than competition between equivalent giants. Along shallower margins, other reptiles occupied habitats that rarely overlapped completely with the open water domain of giant ichthyosaurs. Thalattosaurs had elongated bodies, long tails, and skulls adapted to varied coastal diets. Their fossils reveal animals closely associated with marine environments, especially nearer continental margins. Some possessed unusual crushing teeth capable of processing hard-shelled prey. They belonged to the same oceanic world, but lived within a different ecological geometry. Near rivers and estuaries, phytosaurs created another boundary. These archosaurs resembled crocodiles in overall appearance, with elongated jaws and armored bodies, yet they were not crocodiles. Most evidence places them primarily in freshwater and marginal environments. Their lives unfolded along channels, floodplains, and coastal transitions rather than far offshore, where a giant ichthyosaur could spend its existence without approaching land. Beneath these reptiles lay the prey network that made their separation possible. Fishes occupied many feeding levels. Cephalopods moved through open water. Shelled organisms covered portions of the seafloor, while smaller animals transferred energy upward from plankton and other primary consumers. Predators could specialize because prey was distributed unevenly through depth, habitat, season, and size. Yet the Rhaetian ecosystem was not simply a stable climax waiting for catastrophe. Marine communities were changing before the Triassic ended. Ammonite diversity had suffered repeated disruptions throughout the period, with turnovers reshaping lineages long before the final boundary. Environmental instability increasingly affected marine habitats as Pangaea began to rift and immense volcanic systems developed along the opening Atlantic region. Those stresses did not erase the food web immediately. Ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, fishes, cephalopods, and coastal reptiles continued occupying their separate spaces. Ecological structure could persist even as its foundations changed beneath it. Ichthyotitan, therefore, belonged not to an empty sea dominated by a solitary giant, but to a finely divided community. Its exceptional dimensions represented one solution among many, supported by an ecosystem complex enough to accommodate predators from coastal specialists to enormous pelagic reptiles. Near the close of the Triassic, those niches still functioned, even as the biological arrangements surrounding them became increasingly fragile. Long before an ocean opened between the future continents, the first architecture of separation was being written into Pangaea. During the Rhaetian, the supercontinent remained immense and connected, yet portions of its crust were being stretched. Faults developed across broad rift basins, blocks of crust subsided, and low regions gathered lakes and sediments. Ichthyotitan lived while this geological reorganization was already reshaping the margins of its marine world. One of the most important zones of extension ran between regions that would eventually become eastern North America, northwestern Africa, and parts of Europe. Today, these lands stand on opposite sides of the Atlantic. Near the end of the Triassic, they were neighbors within Pangaea, joined across a landscape increasingly marked by fractures. The future Central Atlantic existed only as a developing rift system. Oceanic crust had not yet formed there, but the continental crust was thinning as tectonic forces pulled it apart. The transformation was gradual, uneven, and distributed across immense spans of land. Heat rising from Earth's interior accompanied this extension. Magma exploited weaknesses in the stretched crust, intruding through fractures and accumulating below the surface. The exact relationship between deep mantle processes and the rifting remains scientifically debated, but the geological record preserves unmistakable evidence that enormous magmatic activity was approaching. The vast eruptions associated with the Central Atlantic magmatic province would occur around the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, close to 201 million years ago. Ichthyotitan belonged to the interval immediately before that transformation reached its greatest intensity. Even before the main eruptions, tectonic movement could alter coastlines without producing a single dramatic event. Subsiding basins created space for sediment. Shifting land surfaces changed drainage patterns. Marine waters advanced across low terrain, and later withdrew as relative sea level changed. Along the region now preserved in southwestern England, these movements were recorded layer by layer in mud, carbonate, and other sediments accumulating on a changing shelf. The Westbury Mudstone Formation holds part of that record. Its dark marine sediments were deposited during the latest Triassic, when the area lay beneath shallow seas connected to the wider marine realm. Changes within these strata reveal repeated variations in water depth, sediment supply, oxygen conditions, and proximity to shore. Such fluctuations could reflect several interacting controls, including regional subsidence, global sea level change, and the tectonic rearrangement affecting Pangaea. For marine animals, geology translated into habitat. A coastline migrating across a shelf altered nursery grounds and shallow feeding areas. Changes in circulation could redistribute nutrients and oxygen. New basins modified connections between bodies of water, while erosion delivered different sediments and dissolved materials into coastal seas. None of these processes required the animals living there to perceive continental change. Their environment simply shifted around them over generations. Carbon dioxide also formed part of the developing instability. Volcanic systems release gases from Earth's interior, and the enormous magmatism that followed would inject vast quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, contributing to strong climatic and oceanic disruption. During Ichthyotitan's lifetime, however, the full pulse associated with the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province had not yet arrived. The distinction matters. Its world stood near a geological threshold rather than fully inside the crisis that would define the boundary. That makes the mud surrounding its fossils more than a burial medium. It is a physical record of a coastline responding to a continent under extension. The bones became embedded within sediments deposited while faults shifted, basins subsided, and distant fractures widened across Pangaea. At the scale of an animal's lifetime, the sea could still appear enduring. At the scale preserved in rock, the geography beneath it was already being rewritten. At roughly 1.3 million years ago, the chemistry of the planet began changing with extraordinary speed. Across the rifting interior of Pangaea, fractures that had been developing for ages became pathways for magma. Lava rose through immense fissure systems, spreading across regions now separated by the Atlantic Ocean. The resulting Central Atlantic Magmatic Province was not one volcano with one summit. It was a continental-scale episode of repeated eruptions, distributed across what are now parts of North America, South America, Europe, and northwestern Africa. The eruptions arrived in major pulses around the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. Basalt poured across enormous areas, while magma also intruded underground into sedimentary basins. Altogether, the original volume of magma associated with the province may have approached 1 million cubic miles before erosion and continental breakup erased much of its surface expression. Yet lava itself was only part of the disturbance. The atmosphere and ocean were especially vulnerable to the gases released alongside this magmatism. Carbon dioxide entered the atmosphere in immense quantities. Additional greenhouse gases may have been generated where hot intrusions baked organic-rich sediments, although the precise sources and proportions remain subjects of research. Sulfur compounds could produce shorter episodes of cooling and acid deposition, while repeated carbon release drove longer warming. Rather than a single uninterrupted environmental blow, Earth experienced pulses of disruption, each capable of stressing ecosystems already living near their physiological limits. As atmospheric carbon dioxide increased, seawater absorbed part of it. Dissolved carbon dioxide reacts with water to form carbonic acid, shifting the balance of carbonate chemistry and reducing the availability of carbonate ions needed by many organisms to build calcium carbonate skeletons and shells. Acidification, therefore, placed particular pressure on calcifying marine life. At the same time, warmer seawater held less dissolved oxygen, while altered circulation and biological productivity could further reduce oxygen concentrations in vulnerable basins. These processes reached through the food web. Reef-building communities suffered severe losses, and widespread reef ecosystems became scarce across the boundary interval. Organisms dependent on stable carbonate chemistry faced rapidly changing conditions. Conodonts, the small marine vertebrates whose microscopic tooth-like elements had persisted for hundreds of millions of years, disappeared completely. Their extinction closed one of the longest chapters in early vertebrate history. Ammonites also suffered devastating losses. Only a narrow portion of their diversity crossed successfully into the Jurassic, including lineages from which later ammonite radiations would expand. Across the marine realm, roughly a third of genera vanished, although estimates vary according to the fossil groups and time intervals examined. On land, major turnovers affected reptiles, amphibians, and plant communities as climate belts shifted and habitats were reorganized. For giant shastosaurid ichthyosaurs, the timing carries a stark implication. Ichthyotitan lived close to the end of the Triassic, but its fossils slightly predate the main extinction boundary. No specimen records its species enduring the crisis itself, and no fossil reveals the death of the final individual. What the rocks show instead is disappearance. The immense shastosaurid body plan, assembled through tens of millions of years of marine evolution, does not continue into the Jurassic record. The extinction, therefore, marks more than the loss of individual species. Entire ecological arrangements were dismantled. Food webs that had supported enormous marine reptiles were altered as prey communities contracted, ocean chemistry changed, and habitats became physiologically difficult. Survivors entered seas with newly opened ecological space, but the particular world capable of sustaining Ichthyotitan had passed away. Its last traces remained in latest Triassic sediment, beneath a boundary written globally in extinction, carbon disturbance, and volcanic rock across the planet. For hundreds of thousands of years after the boundary crisis, recovery in the sea did not mean a return to the world that had existed before. Extinction had removed entire branches from marine communities, while the water itself remained unstable. In many regions, the chemical conditions needed by complex animals deteriorated so severely that survival depended not only on finding food, but on finding enough oxygen to remain alive. A particularly revealing record survives in Haida Gwaii, off the coast of British Columbia. During the earliest Jurassic, these rocks formed as sediment on the northeastern margin of the vast Panthalassic Ocean. Preserved within them are molecular traces left by microorganisms, compounds known as biomarkers. Their chemistry records an ocean in which oxygen depletion reached unusually high into the water column, creating conditions very different from those tolerated by most marine animals. As oxygen disappeared, microorganisms adapted to oxygen-poor environments gained an advantage. Among them were bacteria whose metabolism produced hydrogen sulfide, a gas toxic to most complex life. Under ordinary marine conditions, hydrogen sulfide tends to remain confined beneath oxygenated waters or within sediment. During severe anoxia, however, the boundary between oxygenated and sulfide-rich water can rise. Evidence from Haida Gwaii indicates that such waters reached into zones illuminated by sunlight. That detail changes the scale of the ecological disruption. Sunlit surface waters contain the photosynthetic zone, where microscopic organisms capture solar energy and create much of the organic matter that supports marine food webs. When oxygen depletion and hydrogen sulfide invade this layer, the consequences spread far beyond animals living on the seafloor. Primary producers are altered, nutrient cycles shift, and the flow of energy into higher levels of the ecosystem becomes less dependable. The sediment accumulating below such waters preserves the chemistry of exclusion. Where bottom waters lacked oxygen, burrowing animals diminished or disappeared, leaving fewer traces of the ordinary mixing that living organisms create in seabed mud. Organic matter could survive decomposition more readily. Sulfur cycling intensified. Dark deposits formed beneath water that, at intervals, could support only restricted communities adapted to chemical conditions hostile to larger animals. Reef ecosystems suffered especially severe losses across the end Triassic crisis. Roughly 96% of coral genera disappeared, and substantial reef-building communities vanished from many marine settings. Their absence mattered beyond the corals themselves. Reefs create three-dimensional habitat, sheltering small animals, concentrating food, and producing ecological complexity along shallow seafloors. Removing them simplified entire coastal environments. This stressed interval persisted on geological timescales. Evidence indicates that disturbed marine conditions extended through roughly the first 600,000 years of the Jurassic in some regions, although severity varied between ocean basins and through time. Recovery was therefore uneven. Patches of habitable water existed alongside areas where low oxygen, unusual sulfur chemistry, and disrupted productivity continued to limit marine communities. On land, the boundary produced a different pattern. Dinosaurs, pterosaurs, crocodilomorphs, and early mammal relatives survived into the Jurassic, even as many terrestrial groups disappeared and ecosystems reorganized. Their continuity contrasts with losses among several long-established marine lineages. In the water, rebuilding ecological complexity required far more than the survival of scattered species. The sea that followed was consequently more than an emptied version of the Triassic Ocean. Its biological hierarchy had been altered from the microscopic producers upward. Habitats had vanished. Competitors had disappeared, and survivors entered ecosystems governed by new combinations of oxygen, nutrients, temperature, and chemistry. Where giant ichthyosaurs had once occupied the upper reaches of marine food webs, the earliest Jurassic inherited ecological space shaped by extinction and an ocean still recovering from profound chemical disturbance. A boundary in rock can be thinner than a hand, yet across such a narrow interval, an evolutionary tradition lasting tens of millions of years can disappear. For the shastosaurids, there is no known Jurassic continuation. Their enormous bodies, specialized skulls, and ecological range belong entirely to the Triassic record. Ichthyotitan severnensis stands at the final edge of that history, preserved in rocks deposited only a short geological distance from the extinction that closed it. Its remains come from the Westbury Mudstone Formation of southwestern England, within strata dating to the Rhaetian, the final stage of the Triassic. These bones represent the youngest convincing evidence for the giant shastosaurid lineage. Above the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, their fossils vanish. No comparable jaw appears in younger sediments. No enormous shastosaurid skeleton emerges from early Jurassic deposits. Despite extensive marine fossil records from that interval, the lineage does not return. This absence carries unusual weight because marine reptiles continued to fossilize after the crisis. Ichthyosaurs themselves survived. The extinction was therefore not the end of the entire group, but a severe evolutionary filtering that removed some branches while allowing others through. In the scientific description of Ichthyotitan, its researchers placed the disappearance of these gigantic forms within the ecological upheaval surrounding the end Triassic extinction. The family that had repeatedly produced immense animals was among the lineages lost. Survival belonged instead to smaller, more derived ichthyosaurs, particularly members of the parvipelvian radiation. Their name refers to their reduced pelvic region, one feature within a body increasingly specialized for efficient swimming. These survivors carried ichthyosaur evolution into the Jurassic, where familiar genera such as Ichthyosaurus and Temnodontosaurus became prominent. Later, Jurassic seas would contain forms including Ophthalmosaurus, with streamlined bodies and enormous visual systems adapted to pelagic hunting. Yet, the dimensions had changed profoundly. Many Jurassic ichthyosaurs measured only several feet to a few dozen feet long. Even exceptionally large predators, such as Temnodontosaurus, remained far below the estimated 82-foot length of Ichthyotitan. The enormous scale reached by late Shastosaurids was never regained by later ichthyosaurs. Size was only one part of what disappeared. Research examining ichthyosaur evolution across the Triassic-Jurassic transition found an extraordinary collapse in disparity, meaning the range of anatomical designs represented within the group. Before the extinction, ichthyosaurs occupied a broad spectrum of body sizes, skull shapes, feeding strategies, and ecological roles. Afterward, their surviving forms represented less than 1/10 of the earlier anatomical variety. Diversity could rise again through the Jurassic, as surviving lineages produced new species. But disparity tells a different story. More species did not necessarily recreate the lost range of designs. Evolution continued from a reduced set of survivors, and the extraordinary experimentation characteristic of Triassic ichthyosaurs never returned to its former breadth. An ocean could once again contain numerous ichthyosaur species, while still lacking many of the ecological possibilities that had existed before the boundary. Among those missing possibilities was extreme gigantism. For millions of years, Shastosaurids had expanded the upper limits of marine reptile size, culminating in an animal whose dimensions overlapped those of the largest whales alive today. After their disappearance, that particular experiment ended completely. The Jurassic seas were not empty. They filled with new predators, new prey relationships, and increasingly specialized marine reptiles. Plesiosaurs diversified, surviving ichthyosaurs radiated, and later marine ecosystems developed their own immense hunters. But no descendant inherited the exact place occupied by Ichthyotitan. Its lineage ended without leaving another giant Shastosaurid above the boundary, and the evolutionary pathway that had built the largest known marine reptile closed with it. For most of the age of giant reptiles, the upper reaches of marine body size remained strangely vacant. Life returned after the end Triassic crisis with remarkable richness, filling reefs, continental shelves, and open waters with predators and prey. Yet one feature of the older ocean did not return. The extraordinary scale once reached by Ichthyotitan vanished, leaving a biological ceiling that marine vertebrates would approach many times without clearly crossing. Jurassic seas became crowded with new arrangements of familiar lineages. Ichthyosaurs remained swift pelagic hunters, while plesiosaurs diversified into forms with different neck lengths, skull proportions, and feeding strategies. Marine crocodilian relatives entered offshore environments, fish radiated through the water column, and cephalopods flourished in enormous numbers. Productivity was sufficient to maintain substantial predators, but the surviving ichthyosaurs followed evolutionary paths very different from those of the lost shastosaurids. Among the largest was Temnodontosaurus, an early Jurassic ichthyosaur whose biggest species may have approached 33 feet in length. That made it a formidable hunter, equipped with large jaws and powerful teeth, yet its dimensions remained far below the roughly 82 feet proposed for Ichthyotitan. Later, ichthyosaurs generally became smaller and more streamlined, emphasizing efficient pursuit, deep diving, and specialized vision rather than returning to extreme gigantism. Other reptile groups tested the upper limits instead. Pliosaurs eventually produced massive, broad-headed predators with tremendous jaws. Genera such as Pliosaurus reached impressive proportions during the Late Triassic, while Kronosaurus occupied Cretaceous seas much later. These animals were among the dominant hunters of their respective ecosystems, but even generous estimates place them well below the length attributed to Ichthyotitan. The Cretaceous brought another transformation. Mosasaurs, marine lizards related to modern squamates, spread through oceans around the world during the final portion of the period. The largest forms, including Mosasaurus, may have exceeded 50 feet. Their elongated bodies, muscular tails, and formidable jaws made them imposing marine predators, yet they too stopped short of the dimensions achieved by the Triassic giants. By then, ichthyosaurs had already disappeared. Their extinction occurred around 90 million years ago, roughly 30 million years before the catastrophe that ended the reign of non-avian dinosaurs. Rather than vanishing in that later mass extinction, ichthyosaurs faded during a period of environmental instability and ecological reorganization. Studies of their evolutionary history suggest declining rates of diversification may have left them increasingly vulnerable as marine conditions changed. After the Cretaceous ended, marine mammals gradually entered the ecological landscape once occupied entirely by reptiles. Early whales began as shoreline mammals before their descendants became fully aquatic. Some evolved into powerful toothed hunters. Others entered a radically different pathway, filtering immense quantities of small prey from seawater through baleen. Even then, extreme size arrived surprisingly late. Large baleen whales existed for millions of years without approaching the dimensions of today's greatest species. Evidence from whale evolution indicates that truly gigantic baleen whales became widespread only within roughly the last 3 to 5 million years. Changes in climate and ocean circulation intensified seasonal upwelling, concentrating enormous quantities of prey into dense patches. Filter-feeding giants could exploit these temporary concentrations efficiently, allowing body size to expand to unprecedented mammalian extremes. Only then did the ocean again contain animals comparable in length to Ichthyotitan. Blue whales can exceed 90 feet, with exceptional individuals stretching beyond 100 feet, finally surpassing the estimated length of the Triassic reptile. Between those two experiments in gigantism lies roughly 150 million years of marine evolution. Oceans opened and closed, continents shifted, reptile dynasties vanished, mammals returned to the sea, and ecosystems repeatedly rebuilt themselves. Through almost all of that immense interval, the size once reached by Ichthyotitan remained beyond the known limits of marine vertebrate life. Long after the last giant shastosaurids disappeared, another lineage approached the sea from the opposite direction. Its ancestors did not begin as reptiles already adapted to marine life. They were mammals, walking on land, breathing air, bearing weight on limbs and belonging to the broader branch of even-toed hoofed mammals that also includes the lineage leading to modern hippopotamuses. Their return to water began around 56 million years ago, during the warm world of the early Eocene. Pakicetus preserves an early stage of that transition. It was still fundamentally terrestrial, with weight-bearing legs and a body unlike that of a modern whale, yet its skull contained distinctive ear structures linking it to cetaceans. Fossils from what is now Pakistan place these animals near rivers and floodplains. Water was becoming part of their ecology before it became the permanent medium of their descendants. Later forms carried the transformation farther. Ambulocetus had powerful limbs and a flexible body suited to swimming, while still retaining the ability to move on land. Rhodocetus belonged to a more aquatic stage, with changes in the pelvis, limbs, spine, and feet that reduced dependence on terrestrial locomotion. Across millions of years, hind limbs diminished, forelimbs became flippers, nostrils migrated backward along the skull, and the vertebral column became increasingly specialized for propulsion through water. By the time Basilosaurus inhabited Eocene seas, roughly 40 million years ago, the transition was essentially complete. Its elongated body could reach more than 50 feet, and its tiny hind limbs no longer supported walking. Whales had become fully marine mammals, reproducing at sea and moving through an environment their distant ancestors had left behind. Extreme gigantism, however, still lay far away. Early whales were predominantly toothed hunters. Baleen evolved later among mysticetes, descendants of toothed ancestors whose feeding anatomy gradually changed. Instead of relying solely on individual prey, baleen whales developed structures capable of filtering enormous quantities of seawater, concentrating small organisms and schooling fish into mouthfuls rich in energy. That innovation altered the mathematics of feeding. Tiny prey could sustain enormous bodies when ocean currents gathered them into dense patches. Large size increased travel efficiency and allowed whales to exploit feeding grounds separated by vast distances, while immense mouths could engulf extraordinary volumes during each lunge. Yet filter feeding alone did not immediately create blue whale proportions. For much of their history, baleen whales remained considerably smaller than today's largest species. The final expansion in body size appears to have occurred within roughly the last 3 to 5 million years. Changing climate strengthened winds, currents, seasonal mixing, and coastal upwelling in many regions. Nutrient-rich water rising from depth stimulated plankton growth, which supported concentrated swarms of krill and dense schools of fish. Food became patchier in geography, but exceptionally abundant where conditions aligned. Under those circumstances, being enormous could become an advantage rather than merely an expense. A giant whale could migrate between distant seasonal concentrations, store substantial energy, and engulf tremendous quantities of prey when feeding opportunities appeared. Natural selection had found an ecological pathway capable of supporting bodies beyond 80 feet, eventually producing the blue whale, the largest animal known to have lived. The parallel with ichthyosaurs is not exact, yet its shape is revealing. Whales required roughly 45 to 50 million years to move from early amphibious ancestors toward extreme marine gigantism. Ichthyosaurs reached comparable dimensions within only a few million years of their earliest known appearance. Separated by around 200 million years, mammal and reptile arrived through different histories at a similar biological destination. Neither lineage inherited gigantism from the other. Each encountered an ocean capable of concentrating enough energy to reward immense size. Evolution supplied different bodies, different feeding mechanisms, and different routes, while the physics of living in seawater repeatedly opened the same remarkable possibility. Along the Somerset coast, deep time is not locked behind museum glass. It is being released grain by grain. Rain enters fractures in the cliffs, tides remove fallen sediment, and winter waves strike layers laid down when southwest England belonged to a very different world. The process is ordinary coastal erosion, yet its consequence is unusual. Rock that has enclosed fossils for more than 200 million years is continually opened to the present. These cliffs contain a sequence of Triassic and early Jurassic mudstones and limestones, including the Westbury Mudstone Formation that yielded Ichthyotitan. Many of the beds are comparatively soft and vulnerable to weathering. A fossil may remain sealed within them, only to emerge after a storm loosens a few inches of rock. Once exposed, its second existence can be brief. That narrow interval shaped both known discoveries. When Paul de la Salle encountered the first giant serrangular in 2016, erosion had separated the bone into 5 fragments. 4 years later, the Reynolds family found additional material at Blue Anchor, including a piece embedded in a mud slope. Neither discovery began with a quarry, drilling rig, or planned excavation trench. The coastline itself had performed the excavation, removing surrounding sediment until ancient bone appeared at the surface. This creates an unusual partnership between geology and human attention. Fossil collectors walking after storms can encounter material that was inaccessible only days earlier. Paleontologists depend partly on those observations because rapidly eroding exposures cover far more ground than any research team could excavate. The same forces that reveal fossils also threaten them. A specimen overlooked on one tide may fracture under falling debris, be worn down by waves, or disappear beneath sediment before anyone recognizes it. Ichthyotitan, therefore, remains represented by only a small portion of its skeleton, but that scarcity does not necessarily mean the rest was never preserved. Additional bones may still lie inside the Somerset sequence. A more complete serrangular could refine proportions inferred from the known specimens. Vertebrae could reveal dimensions of the spinal column and provide another route toward estimating overall body size. Ribs might preserve clues to the breadth of the torso. Cranial material would be especially valuable because skull anatomy could clarify relationships with other giant ichthyosaurs and narrow the uncertainty surrounding feeding behavior. Finding such material depends on burial history as much as persistence. A carcass settling onto the Rhaetian seafloor could have been disturbed by currents, scavengers, or decomposition before burial. Bones may have separated and traveled different distances. Later compression and geological deformation could have damaged what remained. Even where several elements survive together, modern erosion may expose them at different times, perhaps years apart, along the same shifting face. That makes the cliffs less like a completed fossil site than a moving cross-section through ancient sediment. Every retreat of the rock face removes part of the archive while revealing another. The surface available to collectors this year is not precisely the surface that existed last year, and future storms will uncover beds hidden several feet inside the cliff. Dean Lomax has described the research behind Ichthyotitan as extending across almost 8 years, an interval that reflects the patience required when evidence arrives fragment by fragment. The coast follows a different schedule. Sea level, rainfall, wave energy, and storms continue reshaping vulnerable exposures regardless of scientific readiness. Somewhere within those layered rocks, Further remains may still be enclosed in mudstone, separated from daylight by only a thin wall of sediment. Their survival now depends on a sequence of erosion and discovery. Too little erosion leaves them buried. Too much destroys them. Between those outcomes lies a brief opening in which a bone from an animal lost for 200 million years can rest on a Somerset beach, waiting to be recognized. A species can exist in the fossil record long before science has enough evidence to give it a name. For Ichthyotitan severnensis, that interval lasted 8 years, measured not in dramatic excavations but in fragments, comparisons, microscopic structures, and repeated returns to evidence. Its identification unfolded gradually, with each discovery changing what could responsibly be said about the animal. The sequence began in 2016, when fossil collector Paul de la Salle recovered 5 pieces of an enormous bone from the beach at Lilstock in Somerset. Joined together, the fragments formed part of a syringular, one of the major bones composing the rear portion of the lower jaw. Its extraordinary proportions immediately distinguished it from familiar ichthyosaur material. De la Salle contacted paleontologist Dean Lomax, beginning a collaboration that turned an unusual surface find into a scientific investigation. By 2018, Lomax and colleagues had completed the first formal study. Their paper identified the Lilstock bone as belonging to a gigantic Late Triassic ichthyosaur, but stopped short of assigning a new genus or species. A single, incomplete jaw element could establish remarkable size without necessarily preserving enough distinctive anatomy for secure taxonomy. Scientific restraint mattered as much as interpretation. Even the estimate required careful revision. An earlier comparison had relied upon an incorrect anatomical reference point, confusing the coronoid process with another feature associated with jaw musculature. Reassessing the geometry changed the scaling relationship. Depending upon which giant ichthyosaur served as the comparison, the Lilstock animal was estimated between roughly 66 and 85 feet long. A value near 82 feet emerged as a plausible estimate, placing the animal among the largest marine reptiles known. Then, in 2020, the evidence changed. At Blue Anchor, farther along the Somerset coast, Ruby Reynolds and her father Justin discovered another immense fossil bone. This specimen was also part of a syringular, but it preserved more anatomy than the Lilstock material. Photographs reached Lomax, and the resemblance became immediately important. Science now had something the original study lacked: a second individual, from rocks of comparable age and from the same regional geological sequence. The following years turned those two discoveries into a detailed comparative study. Researchers examined the contours, proportions, grooves, ridges, and attachment surfaces preserved across both specimens. Thin sections exposed their microscopic architecture, allowing bone growth to be compared between individuals and with other enormous ichthyosaurs. Marcello Perillo of the University of Bonn contributed histological analysis that revealed unusual patterns associated with rapid skeletal growth. Agreement between the specimens extended beyond size. Their shared morphology, geographic proximity, and placement within rocks of the latest Triassic strengthened the case that they represented the same previously unrecognized kind of ichthyosaur. Differences could be assessed against similarities rather than interpreted from an isolated fragment. The Blue Anchor fossil effectively supplied a second line of anatomical testimony. In April 2024, the accumulated evidence appeared in the scientific journal Public Library of Science 1. The animal finally received its formal name, Ichthyotitan severnensis. The genus combined the idea of an ichthyosaur with immense scale, while the species name referred to the Severn region associated with its discovery. Authorship preserved the human path behind the science. Dean Lomax and fellow researchers were joined by Paul de la Salle, Marcelo Perillo, Ruby Reynolds, and Justin Reynolds. Fossil collectors, a child searching a beach with her father, and professional paleontologists had each contributed something essential. 8 years separated the first fragments from the published name. During that interval, certainty accumulated slowly enough to be tested. Ichthyotitan severnensis entered science not through one spectacular skeleton, but through 2 damaged jawbones whose connection became visible only through patience, anatomy, geology, and the careful recognition of patterns preserved across time. Along the southern edge of England, generations can be separated by centuries, while standing over the same ancient rocks. A child bends toward a newly exposed fossil, recognizing little at first beyond an unusual shape in stone. The significance comes later. For Ruby Reynolds in the 21st century, that moment created an unexpected connection with another young fossil hunter whose discoveries had transformed the study of vanished worlds more than 200 years before. Mary Anning was born in 1799 at Lyme Regis, along the coast southwest of Somerset. Fossils were part of everyday life there. Weather and waves continually opened the cliffs, and local families collected curiosities from fallen rock to sell to visitors. Mary accompanied her father, Richard Anning, on these searches from childhood, learning to recognize forms hidden among layers of shale and limestone. Her circumstances offered little security. After her father died when Mary was still young, fossil collecting became an important source of income for the family. Yet the coastline was also becoming a place of scientific revelation. Around the age of 12, Mary and her brother Joseph uncovered the remains of an extraordinary marine reptile. Joseph initially found the skull, and Mary subsequently helped uncover the rest of the skeleton. The specimen became one of the earliest, substantially complete ichthyosaur skeletons brought to scientific attention in Britain. Mary continued searching. Her later discoveries included the first complete plesiosaur skeleton recognized by science and the first pterosaur discovered in Britain. She developed an exceptional practical knowledge of anatomy, preservation, and local geology, skills acquired through years of examining fossils directly rather than through university education. Scientists visited her, purchased specimens from her, and consulted her expertise. Recognition did not follow contribution evenly. Women could not become members of the Geological Society of London during her lifetime, and much of the formal scientific world remained closed to her. Specimens she discovered sometimes entered publications through the names of male researchers who described them. Her influence, nevertheless, became embedded within 19th century paleontology, helping establish that Earth had once supported entire communities of organisms, unlike anything living in familiar landscapes. 2 centuries later, Ruby Reynolds encountered another ichthyosaur along the broader fossil-bearing coastline of southwest England. Ruby was 11 years old when, while fossil hunting with her father Justin at Blue Anchor in 2020, she noticed pieces of an enormous bone. More fragments emerged during subsequent searches, eventually revealing part of the lower jaw of the animal, now called Ichthyotitan severnensis. The discovery supplied crucial evidence that an earlier giant jaw fragment was not an isolated anatomical curiosity. The resemblance to Anning's story arose naturally. Both began fossil hunting young. Both searched coastal rocks whose erosion continually brings prehistoric remains into view. Both encountered ichthyosaurs, animals separated from their discoverers by immense spans of geological time. Ruby herself later described being compared with Mary Anning as an honor, Yet their experiences also reveal how scientific culture changed between their lifetimes. Mary worked within a society that could depend upon her knowledge while denying her equal institutional standing. Ruby entered a scientific collaboration in which her contribution could be recorded directly. When Ichthyotitan severnensis was formally described in 2024, Ruby and Justin Reynolds appeared among the authors of the research. Their coastlines are not identical, nor are the fossils preserved within them from precisely the same age. Lyme Regis is celebrated especially for early Jurassic rocks, while the Somerset remains of Ichthyotitan come from the closing part of the Triassic. Together, however, these exposures preserve neighboring chapters of marine history. Across more than 2 centuries, the cliffs have continued surrendering pieces of that history through erosion. Mary Anning and Ruby Reynolds met those pieces under profoundly different social circumstances, yet each demonstrated the enduring importance of careful eyes at the shoreline. Paleontology advances through laboratories and museums, but sometimes its newest chapter begins with a young person noticing that one stone does not resemble the others. There is a particular kind of knowledge that begins with absence. In paleontology, an animal may enter science without a skull, spine, limb, tooth, or complete outline, leaving researchers to reconstruct only what the surviving evidence can support. Ichthyotitan severnensis stands near that boundary. Its known fossil record consists of 2 serrangular bones, elements from the rear portion of the lower jaw, recovered from the same geological formation and broadly similar horizon along the Somerset coast. Those 2 bones carry substantial information. Their anatomy allows comparison with other ichthyosaurs, especially enormous late Triassic forms generally associated with shastosaurids. Their proportions provide a basis for estimating overall size through comparisons with better-known relatives. Microscopic examination of bone tissue reveals patterns of growth and remodeling, indicating that at least the more complete individual had not finished growing when it died. Shared anatomical features between the Somerset specimens support their placement within the same species. Beyond those conclusions, certainty narrows rapidly. No teeth belonging to Ichthyotitan have been recovered. Its feeding apparatus therefore remains largely unknown. Some giant shastosaurids possessed reduced dentition or lacked functional teeth as adults, but resemblance within a family cannot establish the exact condition in this animal. Without stomach contents, preserved prey remains, or distinctive feeding damage, its diet cannot be identified directly. Any reconstruction of how it captured food must remain provisional. Its celebrated length, commonly estimated around 82 feet, carries another layer of uncertainty. Researchers infer body length by scaling the jaw element against related ichthyosaurs, whose skeletons preserve more of their proportions. That method is scientifically useful, but it depends upon anatomical similarity. If Ichthyotitan possessed a proportionally larger head, shorter trunk, or another unusual body ratio, the estimate would change. The fossil supports extraordinary size more securely than it supports one exact length. Movement is even harder to recover. No vertebral column shows how flexible the torso was. No flippers preserve their shape or relative dimensions. No tail skeleton reveals the architecture of its main propulsive surface. Comparisons with other ichthyosaurs can suggest possibilities, yet they cannot turn missing anatomy into observed anatomy. Behavior leaves an even fainter trace. 2 individuals found in the same regional deposits do not demonstrate that these animals traveled together. They could have been separated by generations. There is no known aggregation preserving a herd, breeding group, nursery, or repeated social association. Whether Ichthyotitan lived alone, gathered seasonally, migrated in groups, or interacted socially in some other way remains beyond present evidence. Age presents a similar boundary. Bone histology records growth, but not a complete biography. The preserved tissue can indicate continued development and aspects of skeletal maturity, while leaving total lifespan unresolved. Researchers cannot yet say how many years an adult survived, how rapidly juveniles gained mass, or when maximum size was normally reached. Most intriguingly, the known individual had not completed its growth. The dimensions of a fully mature Ichthyotitan are therefore uncertain. An older animal may have become larger, although the amount cannot responsibly be supplied by imagination. This language of uncertainty matters. Scientific descriptions use terms such as probable, estimated, interpreted, and consistent with, because each marks the distance between observation and inference. Such wording does not diminish the discovery. It preserves the boundary between what the fossils demonstrate and what comparison merely suggests. For Ichthyotitan, that boundary is unusually visible. Two pieces of lower jaw have revealed the existence of an immense marine reptile near the end of the Triassic, provided evidence of its relationships, and preserved traces of its growth. Everything else remains constrained by missing bone. The reconstruction is powerful precisely because its edges are left unfinished, shaped not only by what survived, but by what science refuses to pretend it has seen. Every collapse of a coastal cliff changes the fossil record twice. Rock that protected ancient remains for more than 200 million years is removed, exposing whatever lies within, while the same waves responsible for that exposure begin wearing the newly released material away. Along the Somerset coast, discovery and destruction can therefore occupy the same narrow interval between one storm and the next. The cliffs around Lilstock and Blue Anchor contain soft mudstones deposited near the end of the Triassic. Rain enters fractures from above, tides attack the base, and winter storms loosen slabs that descend onto beaches and mud slopes. As coastal erosion intensifies, fresh surfaces appear more frequently. Each fallen section reveals sediment that has remained enclosed since the Rhaetian seas covered this region, but exposure offers no guarantee of preservation. A fossil emerging from the cliff may survive long enough to be recognized, or it may fragment, become buried beneath another fall, or be carried into the tidal zone and gradually destroyed. That uncertainty gives fieldwork here an unusual rhythm. Collectors and paleontologists return repeatedly because a beach examined after one storm is not the same beach encountered after another. Material can appear between visits. The history of fossil collecting across southwest England stretches for more than 2 centuries, and the discoveries associated with Mary Anning, Paul de la Salle, and Ruby Reynolds belong to different generations of the same continuing interaction between erosion and observation. For Ichthyotitan, the stakes are especially high because every known specimen remains isolated. The 2 serrangular bones prove that enormous individuals inhabited these waters, yet neither preserves the rest of the skeleton. In life, each jaw belonged to an animal with a skull, vertebral column, ribs, flippers, and tail. Death separated those structures from the living body, while currents, scavengers, sediment, movement, burial, compression, and later geological change determined which pieces survived. A complete articulated skeleton would require an extraordinary sequence of favorable circumstances and is therefore exceedingly unlikely. A partial association, however, remains possible. Several vertebrae preserved together could begin revealing the proportions of the trunk and the dimensions of individual segments of the spine. Ribs might add information about body depth and chest architecture. Flipper bones could clarify how the limbs were shaped for movement through water. Cranial material would be even more informative. Additional jaw elements could test existing reconstructions of head size, while preserved teeth, if Ichthyotitan possessed them in the relevant parts of the jaws, could transform interpretations of feeding. Tooth form can reflect how prey was seized or processed, distinguishing piercing, gripping, cutting, or other feeding strategies. Wear patterns might preserve traces of repeated use rather than leaving diet to inference from relatives alone. Even damaged bones could matter. Healed fractures, abnormal growth, infection, or joint degeneration can record events from an individual animal's life. Such pathology might reveal injuries sustained during feeding, movement, or interactions with other large marine reptiles. Several individuals preserved within a closely constrained layer could also strengthen knowledge of variation within the species, helping separate features of age and growth from characteristics shared across the lineage. Yet the same process that makes those discoveries possible is steadily removing their geological setting. Once a fossil leaves the cliff, information about its exact position can disappear unless the find is documented carefully. Context matters because surrounding sediment helps establish age, environment, and association with other organisms. The Somerset cliffs continue to surrender their Ratian layers piece by piece. Most exposures will contain no giant bones, and many fossils will vanish before human eyes encounter them. Still, every newly opened surface slightly changes what can be known. Somewhere within that diminishing archive may remain a vertebra, a rib, part of a skull, or several bones resting together, enough to give Ichthyotitan a little more of the body that deep time removed. For generations, the blue whale has occupied a special place in the human imagination, not merely as an enormous animal, but as the apparent outer boundary of animal size. Its body seems to represent the point where biology approaches some invisible structural limit, where feeding, movement, circulation, and energy demand become difficult to sustain at anything greater. Yet the fossil record now places another shape beside that familiar giant, separated from it by more than 200 million years. Ichthyotitan does not establish that blue whales have lost their title. The fossils are too incomplete for such certainty, and individual blue whales vary considerably in length. Estimates for Ichthyotitan overlap the dimensions reached by exceptionally large living whales, rather than demonstrating a clear superiority. The important discovery lies elsewhere. An ichthyosaur, belonging to a reptilian lineage entirely unrelated to whales, reached approximately the same extraordinary scale in the Late Triassic. That changes the biological meaning of gigantism. Blue whales are mammals descended from terrestrial ancestors that returned to water. They breathe air, nurse their young, regulate their internal temperature, and feed by filtering concentrations of small prey through baleen. Ichthyotitan emerged from a separate evolutionary experiment. Its ancestors entered marine environments during the Triassic, developing streamlined bodies through millions of years of adaptation while retaining an anatomy rooted in reptiles. Whatever its precise feeding strategy, its path toward immense size had nothing to do with whale ancestry. The oceans supporting these giants were equally different. Modern blue whales inhabit a planet shaped by cold polar waters, powerful circulation systems, seasonal productivity, and concentrated patches of krill. Ichthyotitan lived under greenhouse conditions without modern polar ice sheets, among marine communities assembled from organisms belonging to another geological age. Even the arrangement of continents bore little resemblance to the world familiar today. Yet both evolutionary histories arrived within the same remarkable neighborhood of body size. Convergent evolution often produces similar structures when unrelated organisms face comparable physical problems. Streamlined bodies repeatedly appear among fast marine swimmers because water imposes predictable demands on movement. Wings evolved independently in different vertebrate lineages because flight rewards certain aerodynamic solutions. Gigantism may follow a comparable principle, although the ecological requirements are far more demanding. A giant animal needs more than evolutionary time. Its environment must supply enough usable energy to maintain a large body. Food must occur predictably enough for feeding to remain efficient. Mortality must not overwhelm the long growth required to reach extreme dimensions. The surrounding ecosystem must also contain an ecological opportunity where increasing size provides advantages rather than becoming an energetic burden. Ichthyosaurs encountered such opportunity remarkably early in their history. Within only a few million years of their appearance, some lineages had already evolved immense bodies. That rapid expansion suggests that extreme marine gigantism does not always require a prolonged evolutionary staircase. When ecological space is available and productivity can support it, natural selection can move toward enormous size with surprising speed. This makes the blue whale less an isolated exception and more one expression of a recurring possibility. The resemblance does not mean that every productive ocean will inevitably generate an animal 80 feet long. Geological history contains immense intervals when nothing approached that scale. Environmental disruption can erase giant lineages, while changes in prey distribution can make smaller bodies more efficient. Still, Ichthyotitan broadens the ceiling. The largest bodies are not restricted to mammals, modern oceans, filter feeding, or one particular climatic regime. Evolution reached that region of possibility through radically different routes. Seen across deep time, extreme size becomes less like a single summit reached once, and more like a distant landscape accessible from several directions. The paths are rare, demanding, and easily broken, but they exist. Ichthyotitan shows that more than 200 million years before the blue whale, another lineage had already traveled astonishingly far along one of them. Across the history of vertebrate life, the sea has repeatedly taken bodies built for land and reshaped them according to another set of rules. Limbs that once supported weight become surfaces for steering. Torsos become smoother. Insulation thickens beneath the skin. Reproduction changes until an animal can spend its entire life offshore. When unrelated lineages acquire similar features independently, biologists call the pattern convergent evolution, and few comparisons reveal it more vividly than ichthyosaurs and whales. Their ancestors entered the water at vastly different moments. Ichthyosaurs arose early in the Mesozoic era from terrestrial reptilian ancestry, while cetaceans descended from land mammals tens of millions of years after the Nonavian dinosaurs disappeared. No evolutionary bridge connects their marine body plans. The resemblance developed independently because both lineages encountered the same physical medium. Water rewards certain shapes relentlessly. A broad, irregular body produces drag, while a tapered profile parts the surrounding fluid with less resistance. Projecting limbs create turbulence unless transformed into compact control surfaces. Propulsion must move a large volume of water efficiently, and stability becomes essential when the body is traveling at speed. Ichthyosaurs consequently evolved streamlined trunks, paddle-shaped limbs, dorsal fins in derived forms, and powerful tails. Cetaceans arrived at their own streamlined bodies, flippers, dorsal fins in many species, and tail flukes. The details differ, including the orientation and mechanics of the tail, yet the overall engineering converges. Physiology followed another remarkable route. Evidence from ichthyosaur bone, geographic distribution, and preserved soft tissues supports elevated metabolic rates and insulation compatible with warm-blooded life. A remarkably preserved specimen of Stenopterygius even retains traces interpreted as a blubber-like layer beneath the skin. Whales use thick blubber for insulation, energy storage, and hydrodynamic shaping. Both groups also developed countershading, with darker upper surfaces and lighter undersides, a pattern that can reduce visibility against water viewed from different directions. Reproduction offers an even deeper parallel. Returning permanently to land to lay eggs would have constrained a highly specialized ocean swimmer. Ichthyosaurs instead gave birth to live young in the water, as demonstrated by fossils preserving embryos within adults and offspring emerging during birth. Cetaceans independently evolved a fully marine reproductive existence. In both lineages, anatomy and behavior became increasingly committed to an environment their distant ancestors had once left behind. Convergence does not mean evolution follows a predetermined script. Natural selection can work only with inherited anatomy, developmental pathways, available variation, and whatever ecological opportunities happen to exist. That is why an ichthyosaur never became anatomically identical to a whale. Their skulls, vertebral columns, breathing structures, swimming motions, and evolutionary histories remained distinct. Similar pressures narrowed the range of workable solutions without erasing ancestry. This distinction reveals something important about apparent randomness in evolution. Mutations do not arise because an organism needs a particular improvement, and extinction can remove successful forms regardless of their refinement. Yet, once variation exists, physics and chemistry impose boundaries. Water has density. Muscle can generate only finite force. Tissues require oxygen and energy. Heat moves from warmer bodies into colder surroundings. Every marine vertebrate must negotiate those realities. The disappearance of giant ichthyosaurs therefore represents contingency layered upon constraint. Had the end Triassic crisis unfolded differently, their later history might have followed pathways unavailable to us now. Their extinction closed one evolutionary experiment while leaving the physical rules of the ocean unchanged. Much later, mammals entered that same medium and encountered those rules anew. Natural selection worked with different bones, different ancestry, and different starting conditions, yet recognizable solutions returned. In that repetition, the ocean reveals both sides of evolution at once. History can change abruptly, while the demands imposed by the physical world endure. A fossil becomes part of science only after someone notices that it is not ordinary stone. Before the museum drawer, the microscope, the comparison table, and the published description, there is often a much simpler moment. A person walking through exposed rock recognizes a shape that deserves another look. Paleontology depends upon that act of attention far more than its polished scientific papers might suggest. Ichthyotitan severnensis entered the human record through exactly this kind of observation. Paul de la Salle was not leading an institutional excavation when he encountered the first known specimen. He was searching the Somerset coast as an experienced amateur collector. Years later, Ruby Reynolds was doing much the same with her family when she noticed another enormous fragment. She was 11 years old. Neither discovery began with specialized machinery or a funded field campaign. Both began because someone outside professional paleontology was present at the right place and understood that an unusual piece of bone mattered. There is a practical reason amateurs remain so important. Fossil-bearing landscapes are vastly larger than the community of scientists available to inspect them. Beaches change after storms. Quarry walls are cut back. Riverbanks collapse. Road construction opens temporary windows into buried strata. Along coasts, a fossil can emerge from a cliff and disappear beneath waves before a research team even knows it existed. No university can station paleontologists beside every exposure. A dispersed community of attentive collectors effectively gives science thousands of additional eyes. That relationship has deep roots in Britain. Mary Anning supported her family partly through fossils gathered around Lyme Regis, developing an extraordinary knowledge of the local rocks without access to the institutions that defined 19th century science. Specimens she recovered helped establish that entire groups of unfamiliar reptiles had inhabited ancient seas. Yet, the conventions of her era often allowed gentlemen who purchased, studied, or presented those fossils to receive recognition that did not return equally to the person who found them. Modern paleontology can handle that relationship differently. De La Salle, Ruby Reynolds, and Justin Reynolds were not reduced to footnotes in the Ichthyotitan story. They became co-authors on the scientific work describing the animal. Their contribution remained attached to the evidence itself, acknowledging that discovery is intellectual labor when it involves recognition, documentation, recovery, communication, and cooperation with researchers. Amateur collecting is most scientifically valuable when that cooperation preserves context. A bone without information about where it came from can lose much of its meaning. Geological layer, position, surrounding rock, associated fossils, and photographs of the original exposure may help establish age and environment. Responsible collectors, therefore, contribute more than specimens. By recording circumstances carefully and bringing important material to specialists, they preserve connections that transform an object into usable evidence. The arrangement also depends upon restraint. Significant fossils may require professional preparation, legal consideration, or placement in accessible collections where future researchers can examine them. Scientific knowledge grows most securely when unusual finds are reported rather than disappearing into private obscurity. Ichthyotitan shows what can happen when that chain works. An eroding coastline exposed fragments that might easily have been broken further or carried away. Amateur observers recognized them. Researchers compared them. Preparators and specialists extracted anatomical and microscopic information. Eventually, a species that had vanished more than 200 million years ago acquired a scientific name. The fossil record, then, is not merely a collection of bones preserved by geology. It is also a record assembled by human attention. Laboratories can reveal what a specimen contains, but someone must first notice the specimen before erosion closes the opportunity. Sometimes that person carries academic credentials. Sometimes it is an experienced collector scanning a beach. Sometimes it is a child who sees an unfamiliar shape among the stones and decides that it should not be left behind. Deep time leaves warnings in substances rather than words. A band of dark mudstone, an altered carbon signal, or the disappearance of familiar fossils can preserve the chemistry of an ocean after the animals themselves are gone. Near the boundary between the Triassic and Jurassic periods, those traces record a marine system pushed far beyond its previous state. Read together, They reveal processes that remain active in the ocean surrounding us now. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province released immense quantities of carbon dioxide as the supercontinent Pangaea began to fracture. Volcanic activity unfolded in major pulses across tens of thousands of years, raising atmospheric carbon dioxide, warming the climate, and altering seawater chemistry. Some carbon entered the ocean, increasing acidity and changing conditions for organisms that built shells or skeletons from carbonate minerals. At the same time, warmer seawater held less dissolved oxygen, while stronger stratification made it harder for oxygen from the atmosphere to replenish deeper layers. Those changes could reinforce one another. Nutrient cycles shifted, biological productivity changed, and decomposing organic matter consumed additional oxygen. In some regions, oxygen depletion spread upward through the water column. Microbes adapted to oxygen-poor conditions could flourish, including communities associated with hydrogen sulfide. Once such chemistry reached sunlit waters, even ecosystems responsible for primary production could be disrupted. Food webs did not need to lose every species simultaneously to unravel. Removing enough of their foundation was sufficient to reorganize what remained. This ancient sequence matters because its mechanisms belong to chemistry and physics, not specifically to the Triassic. Modern carbon dioxide concentrations are rising through a different source, chiefly human combustion of fossil fuels and changes in land use, yet seawater still responds according to the same chemical principles. The ocean absorbs part of that carbon dioxide. Its average surface acidity increases. Warming still reduces oxygen solubility and can strengthen layering that restricts ventilation below. The comparison requires care. The geography, circulation, ecosystems, atmospheric composition, and background climate of the modern Earth differ profoundly from those of Pangaea. The Central Atlantic eruptions also involved volcanic processes with no exact modern counterpart. Deep history is therefore not a prediction that the present ocean must reproduce the end Triassic extinction. Its value lies elsewhere. The rocks demonstrate that planetary systems possess thresholds, feedbacks, and recovery times far longer than human planning normally considers. The end Triassic crisis unfolded across geological intervals, while the present rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide has been concentrated into only a few centuries, with much of the sharpest increase occurring during the industrial era. Rate matters because organisms and ecosystems require time to migrate, adapt, reproduce, and reorganize. Recovery also has a meaning in geology that can sound deceptively reassuring. After every major extinction, life diversified again, but the returning ecosystems were not restorations of what had existed before. Entire evolutionary branches ended. New communities formed from survivors, and ecological vacancies redirected evolution for millions of years. An ocean can recover biologically while never recovering the world it lost. Ichthyotitan belongs to that distinction. Its remains occur in fine marine sediments near one of Earth's great biological transitions, where unusual environmental conditions helped shape both extinction and preservation. The rock retained fragments of a lineage that the succeeding oceans did not restore. Every living marine species inhabits the far end of that history. Its ancestry passed through repeated episodes of warming, cooling, changing sea level, altered circulation, impacts, volcanism, and extinction. Survival across deep time does not imply immunity. It means only that some branches persisted, while countless others stopped. The ancient ocean therefore gives the present one a longer scale. Change can be rapid, loss can become permanent, and recovery can belong to a future measured not in generations, but in millions of years. 2 bones are enough to alter the scale of a vanished world. In England, preserved after an interval almost beyond ordinary intuition, the known remains of Ichthyotitan are astonishingly sparse. 2 enormous serrangular bones from the lower jaw. Each belonged to an animal whose complete skeleton has never been found. Yet, from those fragments emerges the outline of a marine reptile approaching the dimensions of the greatest whales alive today. That contrast gives the discovery much of its weight. The evidence can fit within a museum collection, while the animal reconstructed from it stretches across more than 80 feet of imagined water. Its world lies roughly 202 million years behind ours, before flowering plants transformed terrestrial landscapes, before birds diversified through the skies, and while Pangaea was beginning the long fragmentation that would eventually produce the geography familiar to us. Ichthyotitan was not an abstraction created by a diagram. Blood circulated through its tissues, muscles pulled against bone, lungs filled at the surface before the animal descended again. Its body displaced seawater in a basin whose shape has vanished, above crust that tectonic processes have destroyed, buried, or rearranged. The individual represented by the better preserved specimen was still growing when it died. Whatever size adulthood might have brought remains beyond the evidence currently available. Deep time makes such facts difficult to hold together. Human history occupies only a narrow surface layer compared with the duration separating that animal from the present. Entire mountain ranges can rise and erode within geological intervals shorter than its absence. Oceans open between continents. Species originate, diversify, and disappear. Sediment becomes rock. Rock is lifted into cliffs, and a fragment of anatomy returns to daylight after nearly everything surrounding the living animal has been transformed. For most of those 202 million years, no human mind existed to know that Ichthyotitan had ever lived. Its lineage disappeared near the end of the Triassic, leaving incomplete traces scattered through stone. Evolution continued without memory of it. Jurassic seas filled with different swimmers. Later oceans carried other reptiles, then marine mammals, and eventually whales reached comparable dimensions through an evolutionary history entirely separate from the giant ichthyosaurs. The survival of these particular bones, therefore, depended upon an extraordinary chain of ordinary events. A carcass had to enter conditions favorable enough for preservation. Sediment covered part of it before destruction was complete. Burial protected the mineralized remains through immense geological change. Erosion eventually reached the correct layer on the Somerset coast. Then, during a brief interval between exposure and loss, human beings happened to be there. Paul de la Salle recognized one fragmentary jaw. Years later, Ruby Reynolds and her family encountered another. Dean Lomax and colleagues saw that the second specimen could illuminate the first. Patient comparison turned isolated pieces into evidence for a species whose existence had remained unsuspected despite generations of fossil collecting along the same shores. There is humility in how little remains. No complete skull preserves the shape of its head. No articulated spine gives its exact proportions. No stomach contents reveal its final meal. Science cannot restore every missing detail, and the gaps deserve to remain gaps until evidence fills them. What survives is smaller than the life it represents, but it is enough to establish that such a life was possible. Ichthyotitan leaves behind that possibility, written into 2 bones. Earth once carried a marine reptile on the scale of a blue whale, then erased nearly all physical record of it. For an immense span, nothing knew it had been here. Eventually, stone reached the shore, human hands lifted it, and a lost giant entered the story of life again. The ocean is older than our memories, and its history remains larger than anything we have yet recovered.